Concerns have been raised about a two-tier justice system in the UK, suggesting that minority ethnic offenders are receiving more lenient sentences due to efforts to reduce racial disparities in sentencing. I am joined by Paul Embery, writer and political commentator, to give more insights on this subject. Welcome back to Riks Europe.
Hello, good to be back.
So starting off, this has sparked debate, obviously. What are the views on each side of this debate, those for and those against it?
Well, it's caused a lot of concern and alarm because it does seem to be a clear demonstration of two-tier justice. We've got a situation where a body called the Sentencing Council has implemented or is about to implement new guidelines which effectively say that judges and magistrates should obtain pre-sentencing reports in certain circumstances, and the pre-sentence report is often very beneficial to the offender because it helps him or her avoid jail in many cases. And the courts are now under a requirement to obtain these reports for certain categories of offender. And one of those categories is where the offender is from an ethnic minority or a cultural minority or a faith minority. So in effect, what it does is it discriminates against white people, and it discriminates arguably against Christians because they're not a faith minority. And lots of people have said, quite understandably in my view, well, this is discriminatory against those people because it means they will stand less chance of avoiding jail because they won't be entitled to a pre-sentence report compared to people who do fall into the category of ethnic minority or faith minority or cultural minority. So there are strong views on it, and even the Justice Secretary herself, Shabana Mahmood, has accepted that it would mean two-tier justice. The difficulty for her is that the Sentencing Council, which have agreed these new guidelines, is independent from the government. Now, there's a debate to be had about whether it should have the power to do what it's doing. So, and you know, whether these decisions should actually rest with ministers. But effectively what the Justice Secretary will have to do, unless the Sentencing Council changes its mind, and it doesn't look like it's going to, the Justice Secretary will have to bring forward legislation to overturn the new guidelines. So it's kick-started quite an intense debate in our country over the whole issue of two-tier justice.
Is there a lot of evidence that has been put forward that people from minority ethnic groups are treated unfairly in the UK justice system, and how much is put forward of the other side? For example, a lot of people were considered to have received very harsh punishment during these protests in the UK, which, of course, I understand were predominantly white people. Are these both sides sort of brought up?
Well, some people have made the case that the new guidelines are appropriate because there is inherent discrimination and unfairness within the justice system when it comes to sentences that are handed down. I mean, I have to say, I don't think the evidence for that is particularly convincing. People have made that point without actually providing much in the way of evidence to back that point up. So I think that largely amounts to rhetoric. And I do think there is, conversely, pretty clear evidence that some of the sentences that were handed down after the unrest in the summer following the horrific murders in Southport were very disproportionate, certainly in comparison to how other arguably more serious offences are treated by our courts. I should say, by the way, that there were some people who did some very bad things during those protests, both on the streets and online. I have no doubt that a number of people deserve to go to jail. Some people committed violence in their communities. Some people incited violence online. but there were other cases which were perhaps borderline, and where people were nonetheless subjected to very, very severe, harsh sentences, being sent to jail for a couple of years in some cases. And there's a view among a lot of people, justifiably, I think, that there is an inconsistency there, because saying something online and then getting a sentence of 2.5 years, for example, while other people go out and commit very serious and violent crimes. I mean, we read in our newspapers every day in Britain cases where people have committed pretty serious crimes, where they've attacked strangers in the street, for example. And quite often they don't go to jail at all. They'll get something called a community order or a suspended sentence. And quite often it takes a lot for people to end up in jail. Usually they would have to be serial offenders before they end up in jail. So there's a sense among people that there is a real inconsistency there. And of course, after the Southport unrest, lots of people, politicians and commentators alike, including the Prime Minister, dismissed any suggestion of two-tier justice as a far-right conspiracy theory, which it wasn't, actually. I mean, elements of the far-right certainly made the case, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. And what we've seen now with these sentencing guidelines, I think, kind of vindicates some of those people who said, actually, we do have double standards here. There are inconsistencies in sentencing, and it's not a wild conspiracy theory to point that out.
And I understand there are arguments that people think that trying to fix racial inequalities in the justice system might lead to other unfairnesses. Is there a risk of that, or is that what we are seeing happening now?
Well, I think inevitably, yeah. I mean, if people are suggesting that somebody from an ethnic minority or a cultural or faith minority should be treated differently by rule, which is obviously what these sentencing guidelines do, then it will lead to obvious unfairnesses. I think most people are of the view, look, if you are a white person or a Christian and you commit the same offence as somebody who doesn't have those characteristics, why is it that you are not entitled to the same sort of treatment? Why should you, because of the colour of your skin or because of your faith, be told you're not entitled to a pre-sentence report, which could be very helpful to you as an offender, but somebody from a minority community is? I mean, I have to say, I think there's a lot of opportunism going on with this at the moment. For example, the Conservative opposition in Britain have been leading the way in attacking the government over these new sentencing guidelines. Actually, they signed off these guidelines when they were in power. There's documentary evidence to show that they raised no objection, let's put it that way, to these guidelines when they were being worked through and when they were first being proposed. And in fact, when you look at some of the worst aspects of, if you like, the radical woke agenda, and the kind of whole DEI doctrine, much of this took root in Britain during the 14 years, whatever it was, that the Conservatives were in power. This kind of thing, sadly, that we're seeing with the sentencing guidelines, I mean, there's been a lot of kind of confected outrage about it from certain politicians, but it's not actually unusual. This sort of thing has been going on in Britain for years. This stuff usually gets nodded through without any opposition from anybody in power, including the Conservatives. So, I don't pay too much attention to their outrage, because I think it's a bit selective. But certainly ordinary people out there, the millions of people who see this stuff going on, they do get unsettled by it, and they are alarmed by it, because what is presented as fairness and trying to level up actually has the effect of being entirely unfair, and I think most reasonably minded people can see it.
Is there reactions from people? Are they losing trust in the justice system due to this particularly being put forward?
I think a lot of people have already lost trust in the justice system. I mean, if you look at the police in this country, there are many decent police officers who work hard. I don't doubt that. But as an institution, the police do not do what they are supposed to do. They are pretty useless at preventing and detecting crime. There is a degree of lawlessness and disorder now on our streets, some of it low level, some of it more serious. We've got, for example, a shoplifting epidemic in our country at the moment. We often see videos on social media of people just brazenly going into stores and taking items and walking out, and very few of these people are ever convicted. This is quite a new thing. I mean, shoplifting has always happened, but certainly not to the degree that it's happening at the moment. And I think that's just, it's born from the fact that many criminals or potential criminals know that they're probably never going to be caught. They'll get away, even if they're on social media, being shown to do what they're doing. Most of the time they'll get away with it. So there's a feeling that the police are more social activists now than they are actual police officers. The police have become quite political, and basically incompetent at doing the job that they're supposed to do. And there's a sense also that the judiciary and the justice system have also become quite politicised as well. Some of the sentences I mentioned after Southport and these new sentencing guidelines that we're talking about are probably evidence of that. So there is a real disconnect, I think, between the forces of law and order and justice, and ordinary people who can see what's happening in the country around them, what's happening in their communities, how the police and the justice system have become so highly politicised. And there is a backlash against that, and I think that backlash will probably grow in time.
Should people be judged only for the crime they committed? Or do you think that things like race or background should play any role in sentencing?
I mean, I think some things should play a role. For example, I think if you're a pregnant woman, then I don't think it's unreasonable if you've committed a crime. Of course, if necessary, you should be punished for it. But I don't think it's unreasonable for a judge to obtain a pre-sentence report in the case of a pregnant woman whose experience of jail, whose needs at that particular time in her life, carrying an unborn child, are arguably different from most offenders. So I think there are probably some cases where a distinction may have to be drawn. I can't for the life of me understand why skin colour should be one of those things, or why the faith that you follow should be one of those things. But that's what's become embedded in the sentencing guidelines. And they need to be reversed.
Some believe also that the issues in the justice system are more about class and poverty than race. Do you think that it is more about wealth than race? And is that something that should be focused on instead? As an example that I know I've talked with you about before, the grooming gang scandals, where a lot of the victims were not taken seriously due to these types of issues, sort of victim blaming type of things.
Well, I certainly think with the grooming gang issue, victims were ignored, arguably because of their troubled background, and in some cases because of their socio-economic status. They were treated differently and they were treated inferior. There's no question about that. I think when it comes to offenders, I'm always a bit reluctant to make allowances for people who are perhaps disadvantaged when it comes to committing crime, because I think if you do that, you're in danger of making excuses for people, and you do away with the moral dimension. We have to remember that in the 1930s, for example, in this country, as in many industrial countries at the time, we were going through a serious economic crisis, a worldwide depression. We had mass unemployment, we had hunger marches, people had nothing, we had no welfare state to speak of at the time. People had nothing like the advantages, if you like, in terms of material well-being that they have now. and yet crime was very low. Crime, both in absolute terms and per head of the population, was very low. We didn't have a shoplifting epidemic, for example. We didn't have the amount of murders and assaults and muggings on our streets that we have now. So, when people say, well, it's all attributable, and, crime is all attributable to a person's economic status, I just don't think that's a particularly convincing argument. So I'm always reluctant to make allowances. But nonetheless, of course, you have to try to make society fairer, and you need to try and close the gap between rich and poor. But ultimately, I think people have to take responsibility for what they do.
And what consequences or risks do you see involved in this going through? Also, is there something positive that can come of it?
I don't think there's anything positive that can come of it at all. I mean, we're going to be in a bizarre situation after the 1st of April when these guidelines are due to be introduced. We're going to be in a bizarre situation where the Justice Secretary herself, the politician ultimately in charge of the justice system, accepts that there is a two-tier system of justice in place. She has already accepted that, and she said that these sentencing guidelines have to be reversed. So unless they are reversed before the 1st of April, then we are going to have a two-tier justice system in place by the Justice Secretary's own admission. So all of the previous talk about it being a far-right conspiracy theory will have to go out of the window by definition. And she's going to have to move quickly. Unless the Sentencing Council backs down, she's going to have to presumably bring forward some sort of emergency legislation to rectify the matter. Because it's just not sustainable. You can't have a system of justice that A is two-tier and B that the Justice Secretary herself recognises to be two-tier. That system cannot be allowed to stand.
Thank you very much, Paul Embery, writer and political commentator, for your insights.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.